Welcome back to another session of EDI Wednesday. EDI Wednesday is a thought leadership podcast series from us here at the Institute for Equity University Center, where we discuss serious EDI issues affecting the people across the world, but also in education and society. This morning, our guest is Professor Jonathan Glazzard, Professor of Inclusive Education at the University of Hull, but also a Fellow of the Institute for Equity University Center. In fact, a founding fellow, I want to add. Jonathan, so good to have you.
Hi, Paul. Good morning.
Jonathan wants to talk to us a little bit today about EDI and playbooks and their inclusiveness, but also prison education and what's kind of fueling the school to prison pipeline and the impact of this on school exclusion, but also want to look at the role of education in youth offenders institutions and just talk a little bit about youth offenders institutions a little bit more broadly, because many people don't have a good idea of what those are, how many there are, and what they do. But before we talk about the serious stuff, Jonathan, do you want to just give us a minute's introduction about who you are and your work, just so people can have a sense of that?
Yeah, sure, Paul. So I'm Jonathan Glazzard. I'm Professor of Education for Social Justice at the University of Hull. My work focuses on broad issues of social justice. At the moment, I'm focusing a lot on the experiences of people in young offenders institutions and prisons, and I'm collaborating also with a prisoner as well. And we're co-writing and co-publishing and co-producing. But in the past, my work's focused on special educational needs, mental health, LGBTQ, so broad issues around inclusion and how to support children and young people that are often, sadly, at the margins, the ones that are oppressed and the ones that often get excluded.
Well, that's really important work, Jonathan. Really important work, and I know you've come to talk to us today about some of those kids who are hard pressed and some of them at the margin. So your work is around the children in the criminal justice system, and I wonder, Jonathan, could you just set out for us how big an issue this is? As I said in the introduction, many people haven't even thought about this. So how big an issue this is in terms of our children in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so I think first of all it's important to explain what we mean by young offenders institutions, because across the world different terms are used. So juvenile detention centres, youth justice, young offenders institutions, youth justice centres. So within England, within the UK, we use the term young offenders institutions to refer to children who are pre-18, who've been convicted of a criminal offence, but they're not old enough to go to adult prison. So often they go into a young offenders institution. There are a few other institutions they could go into. They could go into a secure children's centre. or a secure training centre, but a lot of them end up in young offenders institutions. And then if they've got a long sentence, then when they get to 18, if it's deemed appropriate, then they transfer to an adult prison.
Mm.
So I think it's quite a significant problem, and one of the issues, there's a few issues to talk about in this session, but one of the issues is the rate of exclusions in school, because we know that school exclusion, so the act of excluding a child from education, actually places children on a school to prison pipeline. So many children actually who end up in young offenders institutions have actually been excluded from school. So I mean, obviously, schools need to think about using exclusion only as a last resort, particularly
But
permanent
but I'm sure
exclusion.
schools only. I'm sure. Sorry to talk over you, Jonathan, but I'm sure schools, any schools that exclude a child, would only be using that as a last resort.
Well, yeah, we would hope that would be the case, definitely. However, the concerning picture is when we look at the kind of children who are being excluded. So what we're seeing is, so in 2024, so I've just got some figures here. So in 2024, we had 10,885 permanent exclusions. But then when you break it down, there are certain groups of children who are more likely to be excluded. So children from mixed ethnic backgrounds, children who are white, Caribbean, Gypsy Roma children, Pakistani children, those kind of groups are more likely to be excluded, and also children with special educational needs. So in 2024, 5,600 permanent exclusions were children with special educational needs. And then also when you look at gender, we're seeing double the rate of male exclusion compared to female exclusion. So we had in 2024 7,600 males compared to 3,000 girls. So we're seeing many more males, many more boys being excluded. We're seeing particular groups of children that are more likely to be excluded, and so therefore we're seeing a discrepancy. And what that then means is that particular groups of children, because certain groups of children are more likely to be excluded, when we then look at the prison population and young offenders, but also adult prisons, we're seeing particular demographics within the prison population. So we are seeing a very high proportion of children with special educational needs and learning difficulties, learning disabilities within the prison estate. We're also seeing very high proportions of children with mixed ethnicities. So
Thank you for
I
that.
think when you dig down further, I think it's quite concerning.
Of course it is. Of course it is. And I mean, when the numbers you have read out are really shocking. And but they speak to a broader pattern of structural inequality, because I remember when Theresa May, as Prime Minister, commissioned the race disparity audit. These same groups of students, same groups of learners, white working class, black Caribbean, Pakistani, Gypsy Roma, mixed heritage kids, they were the ones who were most at risk of exclusion. And also, if you were a young person who had special education needs, um, you will even be more likely. Um, and so this points to real systemic and structural inequality and institutional inequality. But but I wonder then, what do you think is driving some of these things? Because surely um, this data has been out for a number of years, but it's the same thing year in, year on, year in, year on. So what is it that the institutions are not getting right? What is it that our policymakers and our school leaders and our teachers are not getting right?
So I think there's a few issues there. So I think in terms of schools and school leadership, I think um, that they really need to think about systemic racism. They need to think about also why particular groups of children are disengaging, and they need to really interrogate that. Now, one of the key issues, I think, within the education system is that the education system isn't fit for purpose. So we've got a curriculum that doesn't meet the needs of children. We've got a curriculum where children can't see their identities and backgrounds and experiences reflected in that curriculum. So, for example, if you pull up the national curriculum and search for race, you won't see anything. There's nothing in the national curriculum around race, which is really concerning. So what that then means is children's identities and experiences are not visible in the curriculum, and they start to disengage. They start to see the curriculum as not relevant to them. So there's issues with curriculum. There's issues with the way in which learners are assessed in schools. So obviously, the way in which they're assessed currently in schools in England is that there's a big focus on maths and English. So children's broader achievements and talents are not recognised, and children can therefore start to disengage them because if, for example, if they're struggling with maths and English, they start to then develop low self-esteem. They get told they're failing. There's an awful lot of pressure on children to achieve those grades, and their broader talents are not valued by the schooling system. So there's a lot of pressure on children. There's a big focus on performance and driving up standards, but then there's also a curriculum that isn't fit for purpose and isn't meeting everybody's needs. So I think there's a few issues there, but then there's also racism. We know that racism exists within schools. We know that homophobia exists within schools, transphobia, all of these things that we see within broader society are also very evident in schools and not always tackled. So, yeah, so I think those are some of the reasons why children are disengaging, and because they disengage, then that leads them onto a pathway to exclusion, and then that act of excluding them places them on that school to prison pipeline. But I think in terms of politicians and what the government can do, I think the government should be starting to think. I mean, they are doing a curriculum review at the moment, aren't they? An assessment review in schools, but I would hope that diversity and race and racism are more embedded within the new curriculum. I would hope that the government are really
Are
thinking
you
about that.
optimistic that are you optimistic that that might be the case?
No, absolutely not. because there wasn't enough reference to that in the interim report that was published earlier in the year. So I think that lack of visibility in the curriculum of different identities means that children and young people don't experience a sense of belonging. If we look at the broader statistics within society in relation to hate crime, over the last 12, 13 years, we've seen a spike in racism. We've seen a huge spike in racism, but then we've also seen spikes in homophobia, transphobia, disabled hate crime within our society. So now I know that some people might say, well, people are more likely now to actually disclose and declare that they're being a victim of hate crime, maybe than they were 10, 12 years ago. However, the statistics do raise concerns about the increasing prevalence of hate crime within our society, and therefore schools play a really key role in addressing this.
Mm, mm. Jonathan, you've said something really important there about disabled hate crime, but my producer is telling me that we're right up to a break. So we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to start there around the prevalence of disabled hate crime, because I think this is really, really important. And then we come back to look at specifically the role of the young offenders institutions, and then how we can try and square the circle with a solution.
My friends, welcome to the Institute for Equity University Center. I want to talk to you a little bit about our institutional support package. Many of you have heard me talk before about our training package, but not so much about our institutional support. In our institutional support package, we do a lot of audits, curriculum audits, policy audits, textual and material audits. So we audit books for publishers and for organizations that want to produce material. This is another area of our work that we want you to get involved with. If you're doing a research project and you want somebody to sit on your board as your project advisory board, or if you are just thinking about embedding EDI in your organization and you're unsure, make us your accountability partner. We will sit with you, we'll hold hands with you, we will walk with you and walk beside you through the process as partners in the great struggle and the great opportunity.
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. What a fascinating conversation we've been having with Professor Jonathan Glazzard, Fellow of the Institute for Equity and University Center and Professor of Education for Social Justice. I got that wrong at the start, so I just want to clarify that at the University of Hull. Jonathan has been painting a picture of the scale and the prevalence of youth exclusion in our school system here in the UK. And within that, Jonathan has helped us to look at the data around ethnicity and special education needs and disability and gender. It really makes for sobering reflection on what is happening to our young people, the next generation, the generation of hope, and what we are doing to them in our institutions. Jonathan, you mentioned as well this notion of an increase in disability hate crime, and I many people would find that very surprising. Many people might not have even considered that, and I wondered whether you could talk to us a little bit about disabled hate crime, what that is, and how prevalent that is within our society.
Yeah, so we had 11,000, roughly around 11,000, 12,000 reported cases of disabled hate crime last year, and like any of these issues, racism, homophobia, transphobia, it can take a variety of forms. So it could be bullying, it could be verbal abuse, physical abuse, it could be microaggressions. But yeah, we are seeing a significant issue there within our society in terms of disabled hate crime. And I think one of the issues, again, like race, is that disability isn't in the curriculum. So children are not learning about neurodiversity and disability because there's no requirement within the curriculum to address that. So I think one of the key things is that we know that disabled children with special educational needs are more likely to be excluded. About a third of the prison population have special educational needs. So that raises really interesting questions in terms of why do sort of 30% of the prison population, and also in young offenders institutions, it's about the same proportion. Why do so many of them have special educational needs, and why are so many of them excluded? So there's a few issues there around disabled hate crime in society, and then in terms of when we have a high number of young people with special educational needs within prisons, how do them prisons then support those young people? And that's where one of the issues is, because often they don't get supported as well as they could do.
Before we come to the issue of the support, Jonathan, because what we are seeing, all our institutions, prisons, schools, religious institutions, cultural institutions, they are microcosms of society. We set the standard for ourselves as a society. And what we have found recently is that there's an explosion of hate. It's almost like hate on steroids has overtaken our country, whether it's racism, LGBTQ hate, transphobic hate, SEND hate, religious hate. It's almost like our country is in this time warp of hate, and I think there's a bigger social problem here. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I completely agree. I mean, again, going back to the hate crime statistics, the hate crime is just spiraling. If you look at a graph of the hate crime over the last decade or so, it's just increased in all areas of hate crime, whether it's racism, transphobia, homophobia, disability hate crime. Everything's increasing, and I think we have to balance that against the fact that thankfully more people are more likely to report that they've been a victim of hate crime, but also we need to think about the role of education as a potential solution to addressing that problem. So we know
Tell
that
us
if we
about that
can
role
get the
then, Jonathan.
youngest...
Tell us about that role.
Yeah, so we know that if we can educate the youngest children, starting with early years primary school children, and then into secondary school, about hate crime, about prejudice, about discrimination, and make that a really big part of the curriculum, then we have some hope that we can transform attitudes, values, and beliefs, because actually young people's attitudes, values, and beliefs can be changed much more easily than changing adult perceptions and opinions. Now, we know that young people might be growing up in households where they're exposed to racism and sexism, misogyny, etc., disability, prejudice. However, schools have got a really key role in challenging some of those values, and the role of education isn't just for children to get good examination results. The role of education is to get decent, well-rounded, responsible people going into society, and I think sometimes there's not enough emphasis on that.
I think so. Tell us a little bit then about the role of the young offenders institutions themselves. Because
Yeah,
you know, uh, many of these institutions doing a tremendous job, a very hard job. But if we're not careful, you have prejudices
yeah,
being reinforced. So, can you help us to understand the
yeah,
critical role that these institutions play in rehabilitation, but also in the
yeah. So,
promotion of social justice?
I mean, they do play a critical role, and we do need. You are right, Paul, to acknowledge that they're working within a very challenging context. They're working with many young people who've experienced trauma, abuse, neglect, adverse childhood experiences. Many of these young people have been living in care. So, as well as being excluded from school, they've also had other family issues or problems, and also there might have been issues within the community as well. So, they're working with a challenging population, and most of the people who work in those institutions actually do so because they want to help those young people to turn themselves around and transform themselves. However, we know that the rate of reoffending, for young people is 32%. So about a third of them, just over a third of them who go into young offenders institutions then end up reoffending, and it becomes a revolving door. Now, what we also know from the research, there's very, very extensive research to show that education is the single thing that when they get into those institutions, it's the single thing that will help to transform those young people and help them to develop a new pro-social identity. So education is absolutely critical, because otherwise we're just going to end up with a revolving door and people going back into prison. Now, the problem there is Ofsted have reviewed the quality of education in young offenders institutions in 2024, and they found some serious issues, and they wrote a report and they called it a decade of declining quality. So what they found is that often education isn't prioritised within young offenders institutions. There's often very poor attendance at education classes. The quality of teaching is often poor. The leadership of education is poor. Many young people don't receive, they're supposed to get 15 hours of education. Many of them are only getting 10 hours or even less than that. Lessons are frequently cancelled. Lessons are disrupted by poor behaviour and disengagement. There's often, even for those who've got GCSEs, there's often limited opportunities for them to study at a higher level if they want to go beyond GCSE and maybe do more advanced qualifications. One of the fundamental issues here is that the curriculum isn't fit for purpose. So often young people, when they go into young offenders institutions, they don't want to do education because the curriculum, they don't see the relevance of it, they don't see the purpose of it. Often it's not ambitious enough for them. Often it doesn't relate to their future goals. So often they don't have enough opportunity to do vocational education, to learn a skill or to learn a trade. And a few years ago, there's something called release on temporary license, where they can be released into the community to do work placements, which then helps them to develop skills and employability skills for when they get released into the community. They're then skilled and can take up employment. However, now what we're seeing is the opportunity for release on temporary licenses is being restricted, and not enough of them are having those opportunities. One of the other
But
issues is
can I
that
just
when
ask
they go
something
into
here?
young offenders, yeah,
Can I just double check something here, Jonathan? So the curriculum doesn't seem to be working out within the institutions, but it also seems like there's probably a crisis of management within those institutions, based on what that report is saying. But it also seemed to me
yeah,
that there's almost like a double whammy effect, where some of the behavioral challenges that arguably got some of these young people into these young offenders institutions in the first place is also following
yeah,
them in these institutions. So
yeah,
how do we square the circle?
yeah. Well, the approaches that have been used in school to manage behaviour and also the approaches that have been used to educate children in schools are not going to work. So if those approaches are just reproduced within a prison context, they're not going to work because they've already disengaged from education anyway. So doing more of the same, and asking them to fill worksheets in and asking them to do maths exercises or simple grammar exercises, which a lot of them spend their time doing, actually isn't going to be helpful within a prison context. So if we get the curriculum right, and I think also, Paul, if we involve the young people in shaping that curriculum, so that they're involved in shaping their learning plans, they're involved in making decisions about what they want to learn and what they want to do in the future, that would be a starting point, I think. So I think, we
Brilliant.
need to think about different approaches.
Well, I think that's a very positive place to wrap up our conversation on. I think getting the curriculum right so we can foster and create those pro-social identities. And as you say, Jonathan, it's also bringing young people into discussion and debate about what it is they want to learn, how they want to learn, to be able to better
Yeah,
understand how they have got to
yeah,
these places in the first place, and therefore to build out the support they need according to their personalities and their unique circumstances.
yeah, because we need to remember, Paul, that at the end of the day, they're children. Yes,
Mm.
they might be a prisoner, they might be an offender, they have that identity, but they're also children. So, that should be our starting point. And at the end of the day, these places should be places of rehabilitation, not places of further punishment, because they've already been punished because they've lost their liberty. Right, so that's a punishment. What we then need to do when we get them in there is we need to rehabilitate them, and education is critical in that rehabilitation process. But working with the young people, getting their views on how it's working, helping them shape the curriculum, involving them in every stage of the process, I think is the way forward.
I think you have said it there. Young offenders are children too. What a profound point on which to finish.
Yeah.
Just some quick fire questions before we wrap up, Jonathan. As many of these as you can answer. Again, these are light-hearted questions for our audience, our global audience, to get a sense of who you are. So, just answer as many of these as you can. So, what was your last Google search?
I think I was probably looking at prison education, to be honest, because it's my focus all the time at the moment.
Yes, yes. When was the last time you misplaced your key?
About a month ago, I couldn't get into my office in work. I couldn't find my key anywhere. I had to go and ask for another key to get into my room.
What's your hidden talent?
Well, my hidden talent at the moment is that I've mastered how to use an Apple Watch, which to me that's a talent. And I've managed to work out how to take it into the swimming pool to record my swim.
Oh, wow.
That's a talent.
And finally, what's your favorite type of weather?
I like the snow.
You like the snow. You like the snow.
Yeah.
Well, who doesn't like a little bit of snow? It reminds us of Christmas and family and homeliness and all of that. So there you have it, my friends. Another one of our podcasts, EDI Wednesday, where thought leadership abounds here at the Institute for Equity University Center. Our guest today has been Professor Jonathan Glazzard, Professor of Education for Social Justice at the University of Hull, and also founding fellow of the Institute for Equity University Center. Stay tuned for the next episode and see you next time.